So this week we are drawing 4 sketch cards for the homework assignment. Just measure your paper 2.5 by 3 inches, and that is the size of the sketch card. And most people just draw a big head on the sketch card. It's pretty standard because they're tiny, but I like to play with the figures, and I think of it as a thumbnail for a potentially larger piece. Because back in the day when illustrators like Norman Rockwell or J.C. Leyendecker, Dean Cornwell, any painter, even way back longer than that, before they do a big piece for a mural or even for a magazine illustration, they would do little thumbnails, little studies, and try to solve some problems at this stage. uh, the stuff that we were talking about, like proportions, getting gesture to read, getting the silhouette shapes to look appealing. Maybe we would figure out how to render some materials. I'm drawing Daredevil here, and you notice in the beginning I try to avoid erasing because it just takes up a lot of time. So I try to draw as much as I can without erasing. This is a very typical superhero pose where the guy is jumping towards the camera and one arm is forward. This is Daredevil, so he's got these horns, a latex suit, so it's got a little shine to it, and like 2 big D's on his chest for Daredevil. This is his comic costume. In the Netflix TV show, he doesn't have the double D's on his chest. But I'm doing the comic book version. And I know we went over basic proportions, and all that proportions change when things are foreshortened. So all those measurements, like 8 heads, it doesn't help you anymore. But it still helps to imagine it in a three-dimensional space as you're drawing it. And what helps you in these foreshortened space poses is just looking at the silhouette of the whole thing. Like if you draw an outline around the whole thing, would that silhouette look good? Would it read? Or is it possible to understand what's happening just by looking at the silhouette? That's what I'm thinking about. And hands are a pain, but you could always look at your own hands or take your cell phone and snap a picture of your own hands for reference. But like I said, these are sketch cards. They're meant to be loose. I try not to noodle them too much. I'd rather think of them as sketches, thumbnails, and you get to experiment with color a little bit too, yeah, in the thumbnails. And I'm gonna indicate some background. I'm not gonna go nuts and draw like a whole city, but I'm just gonna put like 2 buildings. My idea is that we're looking up at him, and through a wide lens, so there's a lot of distortions. All the straight lines would curve, and I just indicate the details in the building. So I finally got around to using the gummy eraser. You can use any eraser, but the best way to clean your drawing up is just to erase it to the point where you can barely see it, and do clean pencils on top of it, like decide which line to keep. But I'm just gonna go straight into inks because, like I said, these are sketch cards. They're quick. I'm not gonna noodle them too much. So these are the Copic SP Multiliner pens. I really like these because they come in a lot of different widths, and the ink is permanent and waterproof. They're also Copic marker proof. If you use Copic markers, they won't bleed. But I like to color with watercolor, so these are pretty nice. You can replace the ink cartridges, and the body of the pen is metal, so I kind of like the heavier weight feel of these pens. I usually like to sketch with the finer width. This is either a .01. Yeah, this is a .01, but you could do it with a .03, and I usually like to go over the outline with a thicker width, like a .5. So the idea behind inking is just to clean up your drawing, get rid of the some of the sketchiness in it. The way that his baton was parallel to his leg was bothering me, so I pointed it out to the side. I guess we're getting a little bit into composition now. This is an action pose, so I'm thinking of using the diagonals. Diagonals are the best way to show action immediately. It also helps you fit the pose in better when the cards are so small, if you pose them diagonally. So I'm not looking at much reference. I mean, Daredevil, the comic book costume, he basically just has a belt, the double D's. He has these two sticks, um, and some big pockets on his pants. I guess where he puts those sticks into. And for the forearm, it's like a cylinder coming towards us. So if we're looking at a flat shape, it's just kind of circular. There's a lot of overlap in that area because of the foreshortening. And I'm starting to think about the light a little bit. I want the light to be from the bottom right side. So I'll make it dark everywhere else when I start filling in the blacks. So before I start making too many lines and putting too many textures in there, I want to make sure that it's simple enough so that it doesn't look like I overworked it or super tight or something. I still want to keep it sketchy, keep it loose, but when I make my marks, try to make them neat, because at this scale, even though I'm trying to relax while I draw, at this scale, if your hand shakes a little bit, your error is like huge. So that's the down point to drawing small, but you can cover so much more ground because it is small. Imagine if you were drawing this 8.5 by 11 or 9 by 12 or something. This would take a really long time to finish. You wouldn't finish this whole thing in an hour. So I'm thinking about where to keep things simple and where to keep things a little bit more complex, making the outlines darker. So basically I'm placing him between two buildings, and I'll just put some clouds behind him. Just curious if what would happen if I put the buildings the other direction, but no, I'm just gonna put like this water tank down here so we have like a cylinder form. So we have two buildings on the side and like a New York looking water tank thing kind of in the middle, just to give it a little bit of complexity. And thinking the vanishing point would be somewhere, well, okay, somewhere towards this thigh. Okay, so now I clean up the pencil lines, and Daredevil is just red. There's a lot of different costume variations, but I'm gonna do the one where it's all red. It's just the whole suit is red. That's a funny thing about looking for reference for characters is when you look up a character, there's like 6 different costumes. You just gotta pick one and go with it. So I'm thinking it would be like sunset, and you'd see sunset warm colors reflected in the building. A cool way to make a simple shape interesting also is to create a light pattern on it, and I'll do that on the building that's towards our left, and I'll keep the building on our the top right more in the shadow, so that the light will be coming kind of sideways, hitting the building on the left. And at this point, I just want to fill in all the whites so that we can judge our values more correctly. Remember with watercolor that it's a transparency type medium. Wherever you want to keep it white, don't let the color go there because it will be really hard to rub the color out. But if you want to make a soft edge, just fill the whole shape with water, just clear water, and then drop your color in there and let the color bleed, and that'll help you create a soft edge. Otherwise, wait until the paper is dry and put your color in there to create the hard edges. I want to keep all the hard edges on the character though, so I'm going to keep everything in the background pretty soft and subtle. And although I'm working with color, values are always more important than color. So as long as I get the values right, if my color is a little off or a little strange, it should still look okay if I desaturate the image, and it should still look acceptable. And here's the other thing, so you don't have to put every detail in with when you're inking. If you're coloring your own piece, you can always add it in as you color. So there's like a light band that's hitting this building, and this side would be darker. I'm not an expert with color, but always try to think about your local color. So say Daredevil's red. This building is gray, so or silver metallic, and it's gonna reflect whatever colors in the sky. And I think, okay, Daredevil was red, but which side is warm and which side is cool? Is it a cool red or warm red? One thing about watercolor is everything looks darker when it's wet, but when it dries lighter. And I don't want to get too dark, so I always have to build it up and keep it light at first and then darken it later. So I'm adding saturation. I'm making his whole figure a darker red. What you'll also notice is that some of the color will wash the black out and make the black ink areas look like a light gray. So later on, at the very end, I'll go back in and darken some of those darks again, either using the black watercolor or just going back in there with the ink. So here I'm trying to define the shape of that light more on the building. Otherwise the building is just like a flat shape, not that interesting, but here I can introduce like a light beam, like shines through sideways on the building. Okay, I didn't like the contrast there, so I'm just gonna fill in that area a little bit, lessen the contrast. I added some purples to the dark side of his figure, deciding to make the shadows cool and the light warm. So the light will be from the bottom right, which means the top left will be the cool reds. I'm gonna add a little variation in his skin tone so it doesn't look flat. Okay, let's I want to show you another card. This one I've done a gray value rendering uh, with just the black watercolor watered down. This is another way to approach painting, with the idea that values are more important than color, and which is glazing. This is called glazing color on top of values. So the values have already been established for the most part, just glazing color on top of it. Although I did change the value of the sky by putting the blue in there. It's slightly darker than the white, but you kind of get the basic idea. And I'm using atmospheric perspective, so the little shrub things in the front have more texture and detail, and the grass that's in the distance have less texture and less detail. I'm also thinking about cool and warm, so the ground on the foreground is warmer. Things in the background I'm going to keep cooler. So X-23, her costume is pretty neutral gray, but I always try to look for like a color if there had to be a color. And for her, I always see that color that comes out is always kind of like a bluish purple of some sort. Her hair is also black, but the same thing tends to happen to her hair. When there is a color, it's bluish purple, like a cool color. So she's got these like metal blades coming out of her feet. Her hair goes outside her frame. It's always nice to have something break the frame because it makes the audience think that the life extends beyond the boundaries of your frame, which is always good. So I want the main focus to be on her face, and the way to drive that focus there is to leave more contrast there. That's why I'm darkening the ground so that the contrast between the ground and her legs aren't as big. Adding some warmth to her cheeks and fleshy areas. And she's outdoors, so I'm thinking that the highlights are going to be cool and the dark parts are going to be warm. cool highlights because the sky is blue. I always like to leave some white so that there's more tonal contrast in the overall. And now we have Thor. Same idea with this card. I did a black and white tones layer, and then I'm just glazing color into there. I'm going to use a purple, bluish purple for the dark parts. And again, you could see what's going on here. Everything looks darker when it's wet, and then when it dries lighter. So I always have to go back in. So there are a few different tonal structures. This one is very high contrast compared to the last one. The last one was a lot of midtones, lower contrast. But this one, because of the dark sky and the lightning, we get really, really high contrast. So same with Thor. Most of his color is just bluish or purplish. Sometimes it goes towards the green. And then the only really color you have is his hair is blonde and his cape is red. But everything else, including those wing ears, is kind of like a subtle blue. I'm using a Winsor Newton number 3 brush, which is pretty big, I guess, for this size, but I can cover things real fast. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just keep it simple. I always like to fill in the area with a flat color and then go over it with a slightly darker tone to indicate the shadow. And then I'll do like a wash later on top for like the rosy cheeks. But for the sketch cards being three quarter body on this size, that's pretty much all you have room for. Okay, so I'm using the black watercolor right now to increase the contrast even more. I want to make this really dramatic and different from the other cards. Adding a little color to the lightning so it's not super flat. Just to have some variation. Adding a little color to the gray hammer. And an indication of where the darks are in the hair and in the cape. I'm going to put a tiny little bit of red because some of the red from the cape might bounce into there. It's really subtle though. And that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time.